Hi everyone, this is Mohammed Kubaib. Welcome to my YouTube channel VDI Bus. In this video, we are going to discuss about Microsoft Azure DNS, especially custom and default DNS service provided by the Microsoft Azure service. If you like this video, please subscribe and hit the bell icon for the future updates. If you want to learn more about Azure or Citrix or FSlogix technologies, you can check out my bestseller Udemy course, which is also available in Udemy for Business. Azure DNS, it is a hosting service for DNS domain that provides name resolution by using Microsoft Azure infrastructure. So basically, it is a service which will help you to do the name resolution for your resource in Azure. By default, you will have two types of DNS service in Azure. One is default DNS, which is by default Microsoft is going to provide for your resource, and it is having a domain called internal.cloudapp.net. It means whenever you create any VMs and when you do the name resolution, it will use internal.cloudapp.net along with your VM name to do the name resolution. It means if your VM name is VM1, so when you do the DNS lookup, so the result will come with vm1.internal.cloudapp.net. So this is the default DNS comes along with Microsoft. Then we have a custom DNS, your own DNS server. For example, you have your DNS server in on premise, or you have built your DNS server in Azure itself. Then you can use that DNS server on your VNet, so that all the name resolution will happen using your own DNS server instead of the default one. Let's go back to our whiteboard and we will see in detail. In an Azure environment, let's say you have a VNet and you have a subnet, let's say subnet 1 and subnet 2, and under this subnet you have created a VM which is VM1, and here it is VM2, and the IP address of this is 10.196.1.7, and the IP address of this is 10.196.2.5. So in a environment where you do not have any DNS configured, so by default when you do a name resolution from this VM to the other VM, for example you are doing a VM from VM1, you are trying to do a name resolution for your VM2, then if there is no DNS in the environment, then this name resolution will fail. Okay, so it won't give you any IP address as a result of your name resolution. Okay, so to overcome this, Microsoft will give you a default DNS which is called internal.cloudapp.net. Okay, so whenever you do a name resolution for this VM or this VM, so the result will be vm1.internal.cloudapp.net, and it will give you the IP address as a result of your name resolution, which is 10.196.1.7. So this is about default DNS service which is provided by Microsoft. So you no need to define anything whenever you create any VNet and when you deploy any VMs and when you do the name resolution. So by default, Microsoft will assign this domain name for you to use the to do the name resolution. This is about default DNS. Now let's talk about custom DNS. So now you have your VNet here and you have your subnet 1 and subnet 2, and you have your VM. This is VM1, IP address is 10.196.1.7, and the IP address of this one is 10.196.2.5. The name is VM2. So earlier we have seen when you do the resolution, it will give you internal.cloudapp.net. But you don't want to use the default one. Okay, you want to use your own DNS server. For example, you have a dedicated DNS server which you deployed, either it is in the on premise or it is in your Azure cloud itself. Let's say this is the Azure cloud. So you want to use this DNS server. Let's say the DNS server name is, the domain name is VDI bus.site. So you want to use this DNS for your name resolution. Then we need to use something called custom domain configuration. So in your VNet, you need to mention the DNS IP address of your DNS server. Okay, the moment you mention the IP address of your DNS server in this VNet, all your name resolution, it will use this DNS server to do the name resolution. So once you configure your custom DNS, then whenever you do any name resolution, it will do the name resolution with vm1.vdi bus.site. So it will do the name resolution with the one which you have configured. So it will give you the IP address accordingly, that is 10.196.1.7. So this is how custom DNS works. So in a normal production environment, we will use custom DNS to do the name resolution of our Azure Virtual Desktop or any other infrastructure as a service resources. See the demo of Azure default DNS service. So I have a VM, that is DC and test VM. So let's log into one of the VM. So I'm going to log into test VM. Both are located in central US. So from this VM, I will try to do the name resolution for my DC, and we will see the default response and the name resolution. So I will do RDP to this VM. Now I am inside my VM. So let's open the command prompt. I'll make sure my host name before I run DNS lookup. So I'm in test VM. So now I'm going to do a name resolution for my other VM, which is DC. So I'm going to enter dc.internal.cloudapp.net. So if I do name resolution, so you can see it will resolve the IP address of my DC virtual machine. So since we don't have any DNS service configured, by default Microsoft will provide the default DNS service, which is internal.cloudapp.net. So even if you ping to dc.internal.cloudapp.net, so you will get a response with the IP address of your DC. So this name resolution from the DC to IP address, it is provided by the default Microsoft DNS service. So by default in your Azure environment, if you do not have any DNS configured on your VNet, so it will use the default DNS service provided by the Microsoft, which is the domain name is internal.cloudapp.net. Now let's see the demo for custom DNS. So custom DNS is nothing but you have a DNS server which you built in the Azure. It is a separate virtual machine. On top of it, you have installed Windows Server and DNS role and domain controller role. Or in the on-prem, you have a DNS server and you are going to use the same on-prem DNS server in your Azure. The connectivity will be through site-to-site VPN. So but in this demo, I have a VM which is created in Azure. The name of the VM is DC. So in DC, I have installed domain controller role, that is Active Directory domain service and DNS. So if I go to the VM, this is my VM, DC VM. So I am inside my domain controller, that is DC VM. If I go to add roles and features, so you can see the DNS and ADD, that is Active Directory domain service role already installed on this server. So here you can see ADDS, and then we have DNS also. So we are going to use this DNS server in our virtual network to do the name resolution. So DNS is very important. Without DNS you cannot do name resolution, so eventually you cannot take any VMs in domain as well. So let's go to my DNS management. So here we can see our domain name is vdibus.site. So any VM which should use this domain name for the name resolution. So if it is a machine name is VM1, so the name resolution should be vm1.vdibus.site. So this is the domain name which we are going to use. So earlier by default Microsoft will use internal.cloudapp.net. So when we configure custom DNS, so it will use vdibus.site. So before we configure the custom DNS, we will see what is the behavior of the name resolution. So I'm going to log into one more VM in the same virtual network. So now I logged into the other VM, which is test VM. If you go to ipconfig/all under DNS server, you won't see your DNS server. This is the Microsoft default DNS server 168.63. So you do not see any DNS server belongs to your infra. So because we did not configure it. So even if you try to take this VM in domain, eventually it will fail. So because it won't be able to do the name resolution for your domain, so domain joining is not possible. Let's go to my computer and try to join it to the domain. So it will fail because it cannot be contact the domain controller, that is vdbus.site. It cannot be contacted because DNS is not configured yet. So let's go to our portal and we'll configure custom DNS. To do the custom DNS configuration, first we need to go to the virtual network. So here I am in the virtual network blade. So I need to click on my virtual network. So this is my virtual network on which I have all my virtual machines. So I need to click that. Then I need to go to DNS server. So as you can see, by default it is using Azure provided DNS server. So we need to click on custom DNS. Then we need to enter our DNS server IP address. This is the IP address of my DNS server. So once you enter the IP address of a DNS server, then you can click on save. If you have multiple DNS server, you can enter the additional DNS server details as well. Then you can click on save. So now your virtual network is configured with your own DNS server, so that you can use that DNS server to do the name resolution. So let's go back to our VM and we'll see the result for our name resolution. So now I'm inside my test virtual machine. So let's go to the command prompt and first we will see the DNS server. So yeah, I will go to ipconfig/all. Now you can see under DNS server, our own DNS server is listed, that is 10.125.1.4. So if you do the NS lookup now, it should resolve to the actual IP address. So I'm going to do ns lookup for dc.vdibus.site. So now it is doing the name resolution for my IP address of my dc.vdibus.site. So now it is using its own DNS server, that is a custom DNS server for the name resolution. So let's go to our computer management and we will see the domain join process. So technically it should work now because now we have the DNS configured and it is able to reach my domain controller through the name resolution. So let's go to the domain and I will enter my domain name and I will enter the credential here. So as you can see, now it is prompted for credential to join the domain. So I'll enter the credential and I'll click OK. So as you can see, my VM is now joined to the domain. Okay, so this is only possible if you configure custom DNS. So this is very important with respect to your Azure Virtual Desktop. So when you are deploying or designing Azure Virtual Desktop, so make sure that on your VNet custom DNS is configured with your own DNS server.